I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion, and glory, and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. If we compare this passage with the throne room scene in Revelation 5, it becomes clear that the two are parallel passages. That means the specific things that Christ receives here in verse 13 are those same things that concern the seal scroll in Revelation 5. If I want to know what the seal scroll is all about in Revelation 5, this verse is the Spirit helping me to get there. The wheels of God's chariot represent the church. The wheels are on fire because the church will be caught up in the perfecting process of sufferings. There's one more point here that needs to be considered concerning God's judgment. Daniel says the judgment, which is a two-edged sword, cuts both ways. The judgment is both a verdict that God will pass concerning every individual and the decisions that every person will make relative to the judgment. It's called the judgment of the living for that very reason. A person's judgment will be their ability or their inability to understand and qualify what God is offering them. Given the fact that this will be the time of the latter rain, there will be no greater measure of saving power as a window of opportunity that God will ever be able to offer anyone who will want to be saved. For that reason alone, Satan will hurl all of his fury at God's faithful church, as the saints will be sorely tested. The worst of the devil will bring out the best of the church, as the contrast between good and evil will be so glaringly obvious that no one will be able to miss it. Remember, Satan's counterfeit revival will be void of the true spirit of love and joy that only God can provide. Satan won't be able to counterfeit that, and it will in the end be the love of God that will win the last few souls to God's side. When the most generous outpouring of God's Spirit will become available, there'll be no excuse for having turned one's back on God. That will then be the most critically important part of the judgment process for that person, because it has always been up to the individual to choose whom they will serve. But what God is saying here is that if the world is on fire and it's clear that the world is coming to an end, it only makes sense to look to God for His mercy and His redemption. At that point, a person's judgment is either sensible or totally gone, because that person couldn't deal with God even under the most dire of circumstances. Their judgment will then be their own personal decision that they will have made concerning who is their Redeemer, which says a lot about Satan's efforts to counterfeit everything that God will be doing. Remember, this scene is taking place as the world is finally deciding who is God, what is truth, and what must I do to be saved. Both God and Satan will be at their best when the world and all of the people in it will have to decide once and for all who is on the Lord's side. When God will sit down on His throne, It means the time of the judgment for the living will begin. I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit, in the midst of my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. Understandably, Daniel was very upset because of everything that he'd been shown. So he came near unto one of them that stood by, them being one of the angels that had accompanied Christ to the throne. The angel then gives Daniel the truth concerning everything that he's seen, but his response is very cryptic. Initially, what he says doesn't make much sense. To be perfectly honest, this verse was hard to figure out. No doubt because it's so vague, but even more so because of the underlying assumption that it's based on. The angel's comment is a macroscopic view of the conflict. That's the issue. If there ever was an example of much in little, this is it. If we follow the basic principles of interpretation as we're supposed to, they will lead us on the path of truth, and suddenly the verse will begin to make sense. The context of the verse is the key, that context being the number 4. As always, what's needful is that we break the text down into its most basic component parts. One needs to see the different parts of this verse in order to make sense of it. The first thing to notice here is that the two scenarios are being juxtaposed. The historical chapters of 1 through 6 are being placed side by side with the prophetic chapters of 7 through 12. In other words, the angel is referring Daniel to the chiasm. The angel says, the 4 beasts are 4 kings that will rise up from the earth. As this diagram shows, the equal sign represents the mirrored relationship that the angel says the beasts will have with the 4 kings. This might not seem like much, but it's actually telling us a lot. The angel is saying the first prophetic application for Daniel the prophet will be the same prophetic scenario that the last generation will have to face. In other words, from our point of perspective, the history of the 4 kings will be repeated. These great beasts is a specific reference to the Antichrist. That much we know for sure. The key element here is, of course, the number 4. As always, the number 4 helps to explain what the context of the vision is. The angel is saying this is a side-by-side explanation or revelation concerning the 4 great beasts, since that is what the number 4 always represents. Understand that the 4 kings are not literal. They aren't what one might think. They aren't the 4 historical figures that have typically been associated with the 4 different empires that rose up one after another. In other words, the kings are symbolic. The 4 kings that are contextually linked to the great beasts are the 4 counterfeit faces that will rule over a certain dominion or kingdom, which is what the 4 beasts are trying to establish. The fact that there are 4 of each ties them to everything else that is rooted in the same number. And that includes what God said initially about the image of the beast in Daniel 2. That is the part of this explanation that must be taken into account. The four great beasts are contextually linked to the four kings in that both concern the same image. The image of the beast is not what most people think it is, because it hasn't been considered or defined in the context of Daniel 4 as it should have been. Remember, a beast is a fallen entity. The term specifically refers to Satan, who was the original fallen angel. Daniel 4 makes the point that Nebuchadnezzar followed Satan's example of pride and rebellion, which led to his downfall in becoming a beast. But in truth, the real beast is Satan. The image therefore represents the king of Babylon, who, like Lucifer, tried to take credit for what God had done in making him as powerful and as privileged as he was. The image is that sin of pride and arrogance reproduced in all those that do what Satan did. That's what the image is. And Daniel 4 explains that in the prophetic context of Israel's covenant relationship. The image is a reproduction of the original sin that was Lucifer's rebellion. The angel is explaining to Daniel what the revelation is concerning the four kings, because the issue is bondage and captivity, or we might even say subjugation. Remember, Israel was subjugated to the four different kingdoms because of his broken relationship with God. His lack of faithfulness to God concerned his deteriorating covenant status with God. That was the issue. To that end, the kings were the four issues that God declared to be Israel's real problem. Remember, the covenant was always the issue, and God kept stressing that point because it was the very same issue that Israel simply would not deal with. The angel says the four great beasts will rise up from the earth, which is clearly an anomaly since Daniel sees them coming up from the sea. So, what's the point of him saying that they will rise up out of the earth? Well, the angel is actually explaining what it means for the saints to possess the kingdom. Everyone is accustomed to seeing the parts of the image as a descent from gold to iron and clay, which is a representation of Israel's fall over time. But the order in reverse is equally important because it represents the exact opposite. The image rising up represents the victory of the faith that the church will achieve. What we have to understand is that both Satan and the Holy Spirit will be striving to reach their objective. In both cases, the image concerns the steps that are involved in that process. The image is a representation of a purification process. It represents what happens when the metals are placed in a furnace. The furnace reveals their true identity. The point here is simple. The refining fire that proved Israel to be unworthy will be the same furnace of affliction that will perfect God's true church. That is precisely what the angel says when he predicts the outcome of the ordeal. The saints will prevail. That is good news. The saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom. Remember, the wheels of the chariot were on fire. That fire was first represented here in the image of the beast and the trying ordeal that it will be for the saints who will have to endure it. Clearly, from the perspective of history, only one of the four kings was genuinely adversarial to the nation of Israel. The other three were not, nor were they all instrumental in keeping Israel in captivity. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Cyrus was especially important in restoring Israel to the land of Palestine in order to rebuild the temple and the walls of the city. The four literal kings can't be the ones that the angel is referring to here. Thus he said, "The fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon the earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down, and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings." The historical interpretation of this passage concerned Europe, the Middle Ages, and the reign of the papacy that lasted until 1798. The main problem with this interpretation is that it took Daniel entirely out of the picture, when in fact it had everything to do with the Jews and the fate of Israel as a nation. In Daniel, the fourth beast is represented as both the king's legs of iron in chapter 2 and the dreadful beasts of chapter 7. In truth, they both represent the same thing, which is the iron will of a determined conqueror that exercises the ultimate power of repression. What Rome was to ancient Israel, the beast will be to the whole world. The angel's point is the historical parallel that is the chiasm. The historicist interpretation of this passage was understood to be the period of the Middle Ages and the papal period of 1260 years. The problem with that interpretation is A. It removes Daniel and the people of Israel from the picture altogether, and B. It fails to address what is always the key issue, which is the Lord and his covenant relationship with his people. At this point, we don't need to go over the history of the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes again. That matter has been dealt with enough to make the point that everything the angel says fits. Antiochus and his history with the Jews is the model that God chose to use in order to give us a preview of what will happen again. This diagram lists just 5 of the things that the little horn in Daniel 7 has in common with the dreaded beast in that same chapter. This simply cannot be coincidental, especially when we realize what the last day implications were and will be once again for the people of God. The point God is making here should be more than clear. A reign of terror is coming, the likes of which the world has never seen. And that scenario was predicted by Daniel hundreds of years in advance. The historical scenario of Antiochus' rise to power is also spot on in terms of what it took for him to become the king of the north. It's a well-known fact that Antiochus was not supposed to be the king. He was not the rightful heir to the throne, But again, the prophecy predicted both his rise to power and his reign of terror as the king of the north. He shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. Antiochus thought to change times and laws, and they were given into his hand until a time and 2 times and a half, as he made a determined attempt to put down the Jewish feasts, the Sabbath, circumcision, and all the most distinctive Jewish ordinances. In BC 167, 2 years after his crucial devastation of the city, he sent Apollonius, his chief collector of tribute, against Jerusalem with an army of 22,000 men. On the first Sabbath after his arrival, Apollonius sent his soldiers to massacre all the men whom they met in the streets, and to seize the women and children as slaves. He occupied the castle on Mount Zion and prevented the Jews from attending the public ordinances of their sanctuary. Hence, in June BC 167, the daily sacrifice ceased, and the Jews fled for their lives from the city. No one will dispute the fact that Antiochus was solely responsible for the Maccabean revolt, which contributed greatly to his downfall. Mattathias, the priest at Modin, initially began the rebellion against Antiochus. When he died, Judas Maccabeus replaced him as the leader of a revolt that took 7 years. The revolt eventually bankrupted Antiochus, who had other problems with the Persians and the Armenians, who also rose up against him. Antiochus died in 164 BC from the injuries he suffered from having been thrown from a chariot while he was on his way to Jerusalem to, quote, turn the city into one vast cemetery. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Hitherto is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my cogitations much trouble me, and my countenance changed in me, but I kept the matter in my heart.